There is a problem with Neanderthal women, and it is hiding in one of the most extraordinary discoveries ever made in the study of human origins. The problem is not that archaeologists have failed to uncover their skeletons. Neanderthal women are well represented throughout the fossil record, from Western Europe to the mountains of Central Asia. Their bones reveal injuries, childbirth, aging, and lives spent in demanding environments. Instead, the mystery lies inside the genomes of living people. When scientists decoded ancient DNA and compared it with our own, they uncovered a pattern that nobody expected. The surviving genetic legacy of Neanderthals appears strikingly uneven. Living people outside Africa inherited roughly 2% of their DNA from Neanderthals, yet that inheritance does not appear to have flowed equally through Neanderthal men and women. Some of the strongest genetic signals suggest that Neanderthal males contributed far more successfully to later generations than Neanderthal females. Other scientists argue that natural selection erased much of the contribution from Neanderthal mothers over thousands of years. Either interpretation leads to the same unavoidable question. If Neanderthals and Homo sapiens shared the same landscapes across Europe and Western Asia for thousands of years, why does their shared ancestry appear so one-sided? That question has transformed one of the oldest stories in paleoanthropology into one of its newest mysteries. The familiar picture describes two closely related groups encountering one another as expanding populations of Homo sapiens entered territories occupied by Neanderthals. Instead of complete replacement, genetics demonstrated that the two groups had children together, leaving an unmistakable signature inside nearly every person with Eurasian ancestry today. At first glance, the discovery seemed wonderfully simple. We met, we interbred, the descendants survived. Yet as additional genomes accumulated from ancient skeletons and living populations, the simple story became increasingly difficult to defend. Every new discovery revealed another irregularity, another asymmetry, another clue that these encounters were far more complicated than anyone imagined. The first surprise came from the amount of Neanderthal ancestry itself. Although modern Eurasians inherited around 2% of their genome from Neanderthals, that inheritance is distributed unevenly across the chromosomes. Some regions contain almost no Neanderthal DNA at all. The X chromosome stands out as one of the clearest examples. Compared with the rest of the genome, Neanderthal ancestry is dramatically reduced there. Geneticists immediately recognized that this pattern demanded an explanation because chromosomes do not simply erase themselves without reason. Something acted upon those inherited segments generation after generation until many of them disappeared. One explanation centers upon hybrid fertility. Another centers upon natural selection, removing combinations of genes that reduced reproductive success. Yet another interpretation argues that the pattern reflects strongly sex-biased mating between Neanderthal men and Homo sapiens women. None of these ideas completely explains every observation, which is precisely why the debate continues. Then another remarkable discovery complicated the story even further. Ancient Neanderthal genomes revealed that gene flow moved in the opposite direction as well. Long before Neanderthals disappeared, some populations inherited stretches of DNA from early Homo sapiens. This finding demonstrated that contact was not a single isolated encounter, but a repeated process unfolding across many thousands of years. These ancient populations met each other again and again across a vast geographic landscape stretching from the eastern Mediterranean through the mountains of Western Asia and deep into Europe. They shared territory, resources, and eventually families. Yet despite all of those opportunities for exchange, the genetic legacy preserved inside living people still appears unexpectedly asymmetric. Archaeology tells a similarly fascinating story. Neanderthals were not scattered wanderers drifting aimlessly across Ice Age Europe. They occupied caves overlooking river valleys, hunted large animals with extraordinary skill, mastered fire, manufactured sophisticated stone tools, processed hides, collected pigments, decorated their bodies with feathers and claws, and buried some of their dead. Discoveries from sites in France, Spain, Croatia, Iraq, Israel, and elsewhere reveal communities capable of remarkable adaptability. Their physical anatomy reflected hundreds of thousands of years of evolution in demanding northern climates. Powerful muscles, broad rib cages, large nasal openings, and exceptionally dense bones gave them an appearance unlike any living population, yet their brains averaged sizes comparable to or even larger than many modern humans. Nothing about the archaeological evidence suggests a population incapable of interacting with newcomers. Homo sapiens arriving from the south encountered another intelligent human group that already understood the landscape. These meetings were not isolated moments occurring over a few generations. They unfolded across thousands of years. Some regions preserve alternating occupations by both populations, while others hint at periods of direct overlap. Stone tool traditions occasionally resemble one another closely enough to suggest shared ideas or mutual influence. Decorative objects appear in both groups. Hunting strategies sometimes converge. None of this proves close social relationships, yet it establishes repeated opportunities for contact. Genetics confirms that those opportunities eventually produced children. The obvious question follows naturally. If both populations included men and women living in neighboring territories for thousands of years, why would the genetic contribution appear uneven? One possibility centers upon social organization. Human societies throughout history have displayed strikingly different patterns of residence, mate selection, and family structure. Another possibility focuses upon biology rather than behavior. Hybrid offspring inherit an intricate mixture of genes from both parents, and not every combination functions equally well. Small disadvantages repeated over hundreds of generations can dramatically reshape the genetic landscape without requiring any difference in the frequency of pairings themselves. A third explanation combines both biological and social processes into a single, long evolutionary story. The remarkable truth is that no single answer currently explains every piece of evidence. This uncertainty makes the mystery far more compelling than any simple conclusion. Ancient DNA has revolutionized our understanding of human evolution, yet each breakthrough uncovers fresh questions instead of final answers. Rather than presenting a straightforward picture of two populations briefly meeting before one disappeared, genetics reveals a complicated history of repeated contact, shared ancestry, shifting populations, and evolutionary forces that continued operating long after the first hybrid children were born. Somewhere inside that complicated history lies the explanation for why Neanderthal women appear to have left a smaller genetic footprint than many expected. Whether the answer ultimately lies in biology, behavior, population dynamics, or an interaction of all three, the mystery continues to challenge everything we thought we understood about one of humanity's closest relatives. And perhaps the most surprising discovery of all is that the greatest unanswered question about Neanderthals is not how they disappeared, but how they became part of us while leaving behind such an uneven genetic legacy. The uneven pattern becomes even more intriguing when we move beyond living people and begin examining the ancient genomes themselves. Every new Neanderthal genome recovered from caves across Europe and Western Asia has become another snapshot in a story stretching across hundreds of thousands of years. Instead of representing a single isolated population, these individuals belong to communities separated by enormous distances and vast spans of time. Some lived in the forests of Western Europe, others occupied the mountains of the Caucasus, while still others survived in the harsh environments of Siberia. Yet despite those differences, the same broad genetic patterns continue to emerge. Neanderthal populations appear remarkably small by modern standards, often consisting of isolated groups connected only occasionally through migration. Several genomic studies have revealed extensive evidence of inbreeding within local communities, suggesting that many groups contained relatively few unrelated individuals. Some family groups identified through ancient DNA include fathers, daughters, cousins, and other close relatives buried within the same cave. This picture differs dramatically from the enormous, interconnected populations that dominate the world today. Small populations behave differently. Every birth, every death, every migration, and every successful family carries a far greater influence on the future genetic makeup of the entire group. This demographic reality introduces another layer to the mystery surrounding Neanderthal women. If Neanderthal communities were often small and geographically isolated, every woman represented an important contribution to the survival of her local population. Losing even a few reproductive women through migration, illness, or conflict with neighboring groups could influence future generations far more dramatically than it would in a population numbering hundreds of thousands. Archaeologists have long recognized that hunter-gatherer societies depend upon maintaining healthy family structures across generations. Children require many years of care before reaching adulthood, and adults depend heavily upon cooperation for hunting, gathering, food sharing, and protecting vulnerable members of the community. Every successful birth strengthened the future of the group. Every unsuccessful generation weakened it. Seen through this lens, the disappearance of Neanderthals begins to resemble more than a simple decline in numbers. It becomes a question of whether enough families continued successfully from one generation to the next. Ancient DNA has also revealed something equally remarkable about Homo sapiens during this same period. Early modern human populations moving through Eurasia were not large armies sweeping across continents in a single migration. Instead, they appear as scattered groups connected through surprisingly wide social networks. Individuals separated by hundreds of miles often carried evidence of distant genetic relationships, suggesting that people moved across landscapes more frequently than once imagined. Such mobility would have increased opportunities for exchanging ideas, technologies, and marriage partners. Larger interconnected populations possess an important evolutionary advantage because genetic diversity can be maintained even when local groups remain small. New individuals continually introduce fresh genetic variation into neighboring communities. This process reduces the harmful effects of isolation while strengthening the resilience of the entire population. Neanderthals, by contrast, appear to have experienced repeated periods of isolation driven by changing climates. Europe during the Ice Age was anything but stable. Massive glaciers expanded and retreated across the landscape. Forests repeatedly gave way to open grasslands. Animal populations shifted with changing temperatures, and entire river systems altered their courses over thousands of years. Every climatic shift fragmented habitats that had once connected neighboring populations. Communities separated by mountains, glaciers, or expanding forests could remain isolated for many generations before reconnecting. Genetic studies reveal exactly the pattern expected from such repeated isolation. Local populations drifted genetically away from one another while simultaneously losing overall diversity. Every climatic cycle left another mark upon their genomes. Against this backdrop, the arrival of expanding Homo sapiens populations introduced an entirely new variable into an already fragile system. Contact between the two groups did not occur across a stable landscape populated by millions of individuals. It unfolded within ecosystems already undergoing constant environmental change. Some encounters probably involved peaceful coexistence, others undoubtedly involved competition for hunting territory, seasonal camps, caves, and migration routes. Archaeology preserves evidence that both populations often preferred remarkably similar environments. They hunted many of the same large mammals, relied upon many of the same natural resources, and occupied many of the same strategic locations overlooking valleys and rivers. Whenever two closely related human populations depend upon identical resources, interactions become inevitable. The genetics reveal that those interactions extended beyond competition. They produced children whose descendants ultimately survived into the present day. Yet the pattern of inheritance continues to challenge expectations. Researchers have discovered that certain regions of the human genome contain virtually no Neanderthal contribution, despite thousands of years having passed since those ancient encounters. Many of these regions involve genes connected with reproduction, fertility, and development. This observation has encouraged one of the leading scientific explanations for the missing genetic contribution from Neanderthal women. Instead of requiring dramatically unequal numbers of pairings, natural selection operating over thousands of generations could gradually eliminate inherited combinations that reduced reproductive success. Even a slight reduction in fertility repeated across countless generations would eventually erase large portions of Neanderthal ancestry while leaving other regions of the genome relatively untouched. At the same time, this explanation leaves several fascinating questions unanswered. If natural selection removed so much Neanderthal DNA, why did other portions survive so successfully? Modern humans continue carrying Neanderthal variants influencing immune responses, skin biology, metabolism, and adaptation to northern environments. Some inherited genes appear to have provided immediate advantages as Homo sapiens expanded into unfamiliar climates already occupied by Neanderthals for hundreds of thousands of years. Rather than representing useless genetic baggage, these inherited variants became valuable tools for surviving new diseases, colder temperatures, and changing sunlight. The same process that eliminated certain inherited segments preserved others because they improved survival. Evolution rarely works through simple acceptance or rejection. Instead, it continually filters genetic variation, preserving combinations that improve reproductive success while gradually removing those that do not. This complex process reminds us that the ancient encounters between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens cannot be reduced to a single dramatic moment. They unfolded across countless families, countless generations, and countless individual lives that archaeology can only glimpse through scattered bones and abandoned campsites. Somewhere within those ordinary human experiences lies the explanation for one of the most unusual patterns ever discovered inside our own DNA. The problem with Neanderthal women therefore extends far beyond the question of who had children with whom. It touches every aspect of human evolution, from population size and climate change to family structure, migration, fertility, and natural selection. Every new fossil and every newly sequenced genome adds another fragment to this extraordinary puzzle, yet the complete picture continues to elude us. Instead of shrinking, the mystery grows larger with every scientific advance, inviting us to reconsider not simply how Neanderthals disappeared, but how their lives became permanently woven into the genetic history of our own species. One of the most surprising developments arrived from an entirely different direction. For years, one of the most common explanations for Neanderthal extinction centered upon inbreeding. The idea appeared straightforward. Small, isolated populations gradually lose genetic diversity, harmful mutations accumulate, fertility declines, and eventually extinction becomes almost unavoidable. Earlier discoveries from Siberia seem to support exactly this picture. The famous Altai Neanderthal came from a remarkably inbred family, with evidence suggesting her parents were closely related. That discovery shaped scientific thinking for years because it implied that Neanderthals across Eurasia suffered from the same demographic collapse. If their populations had become fragmented into tiny, isolated bands, perhaps extinction had already become inevitable before Homo sapiens even arrived in significant numbers. Then, an entirely different picture emerged from northwestern Europe. Researchers analyzed genetic material from 27 Neanderthals recovered from 10 archaeological sites in Belgium and France, including an exceptionally well-preserved 45,000-year-old individual from Goyet. Instead of discovering another isolated and genetically impoverished population, they uncovered evidence for something very different. These late Neanderthals belonged to large, interconnected communities that maintained healthy levels of genetic diversity. The genomes showed no indication that these populations were collapsing under the weight of severe inbreeding. Instead, neighboring communities exchanged mates often enough to preserve diversity across an extensive region stretching through the Meuse-Basin and surrounding landscapes. This finding forces us to rethink one of the most familiar explanations for Neanderthal extinction. If one of the last surviving populations in Europe remained genetically healthy only a few thousand years before Neanderthals disappeared, then simple genetic deterioration cannot explain the entire story. These communities were not isolated families trapped inside shrinking refugees. They maintained regional social connections remarkably similar to those expected in successful hunter-gatherer societies. Genetic diversity persisted. Population networks persisted. There was nothing inevitable about their disappearance based solely upon their genomes. The archaeological evidence fits surprisingly well with this revised picture. Belgium during this period contained one of the greatest concentrations of Neanderthal occupations anywhere in Europe. Caves overlooking river valleys provided shelter across changing climates, while migrating herds moved through the region year after year. Rather than representing scattered camps occupied by unrelated families, these sites increasingly resemble pieces of a connected landscape occupied by neighboring communities. Stone tools, hunting strategies, and repeated occupations suggest people moved across the region with remarkable familiarity. The genetics now indicate that they also exchanged marriage partners across these communities, maintaining diversity over many generations. Perhaps the most unexpected result concerns contact with Homo sapiens. These Belgian and French Neanderthals lived during a period when early modern humans had already entered parts of Europe. Some researchers estimate that both populations occupied neighboring regions for hundreds of generations. If opportunities for interaction existed over such an extended period, one might expect the Neanderthal genomes themselves to contain clear evidence of recent ancestry from Homo sapiens. Yet the study found no such signal among these northwestern European Neanderthals. Their genomes remained distinctly Neanderthal despite their apparent proximity to expanding modern human populations. That observation creates another fascinating asymmetry. Living people today carry unmistakable Neanderthal ancestry, demonstrating that interbreeding unquestionably occurred. Yet, despite sequencing numerous Neanderthal genomes from different regions, researchers have yet to identify a late Neanderthal carrying a comparably recent Homo sapiens ancestor in this Belgian and French population. Earlier studies have shown that gene flow from Homo sapiens into Neanderthals occurred much earlier in prehistory, but this latest regional study found no evidence that such exchanges were continuing within these final northwestern populations. This does not prove that Neanderthal women never joined Homo sapiens communities or that Homo sapiens women never entered Neanderthal groups. The broader genetic evidence clearly demonstrates repeated contact between the two populations across Eurasia. Instead, the Belgian study suggests that these interactions were neither uniform nor evenly distributed across space and time. Different regions experienced different histories. Some Neanderthal populations exchanged genes with Homo sapiens, while others apparently remained genetically distinct until very near the end. Human evolution therefore becomes less a single continental story than a mosaic of regional histories unfolding simultaneously. This regional complexity makes the mystery surrounding Neanderthal women even more compelling. If healthy, genetically connected Neanderthal communities still existed in Belgium shortly before their disappearance, then the question shifts dramatically. We are no longer asking why isolated, genetically exhausted populations vanished. We are asking why successful populations capable of maintaining diversity, exchanging mates, and occupying productive landscapes ultimately failed to persist while Homo sapiens expanded across the same continent. That is a far more difficult question because it cannot be answered simply by pointing toward inbreeding. The latest discoveries therefore narrow the search rather than ending it. Climate fluctuations undoubtedly reshaped European environments. Competition for territory and resources certainly influenced both populations. Cultural differences, technology, disease, fertility, and population growth all remain active areas of investigation. Yet one explanation has clearly become less persuasive. At least in northwestern Europe, the final Neanderthals were not simply the last descendants of isolated families trapped inside a genetic dead end. They were members of vibrant regional networks whose diversity rivaled that expected in healthy hunter-gatherer societies. Instead of solving the mystery, this remarkable study makes it even deeper. Healthy populations do not simply vanish without explanation. Their disappearance demands a process powerful enough to overcome communities that had already demonstrated resilience through changing climates and thousands of years of survival. Combined with the evidence for repeated contact between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, the discovery suggests that the final chapter of Neanderthal history was far more dynamic than anyone imagined. Rather than fading quietly through genetic decline, these communities appear to have remained viable almost until the very end. That realization changes the entire conversation. The question is no longer whether Neanderthals were already doomed. The question is what happened next.